Duskwood lies immediately south of Elwyn Forest, within sight of the heartland of Stormwind, although crossing the river into it feels like entering a place much farther away. The daylight fades beneath a heavy sky, the trees grow close around the road, and the settled farms of Elwyn give way to abandoned houses, overgrown fields, and graveyards whose dead no longer remain at rest beneath the earth. The region did not always look this way. It was once called Brightwood, and in older accounts it formed the southern reaches of Elwyn Forest, a fertile part of the kingdom where people farmed the land and travelled between Stormwind, Westfall, Redridge, and the southern road into Stranglethorn. The settlement now known as Darkshire was called Grand Hamlet, while Ravenhill was a living community beside a cemetery that had not yet grown to dominate the western woods. Brightwood's decline began during the First War, when the orcs of the Old Horde invaded the Kingdom of Stormwind after entering Azeroth through the Dark Portal. The man who had opened that portal was Medivh, the guardian of Tirisfal, who had carried the spirit of Sargeras within him since before his birth. From Karazhan, on the far side of Deadwind Pass, Medivh worked with Gul'dan to create the passage between Azeroth and Draenor, and when his role in the invasion was discovered, Anduin Lothar, Khadgar, and Garona entered the tower to confront him. Medivh was killed inside Karazhan, and the fell power gathered around him was released into the surrounding land. Deadwind Pass became a barren and lifeless place, while the forest to its west was left beneath a lasting pool of darkness. Brightwood slowly became known as Duskwood, and Grand Hamlet took the name Darkshire. Warcraft's accounts have sometimes connected the wider corruption of the region to the Scythe of Elune as well, although the Scythe arrived later in Duskwood's history, and its clearest effect was the spread of the Worgen. The unnatural twilight over the forest is generally traced back to the death of Medivh and the fell magic that escaped from Karazhan. Stormwind itself fell near the end of the First War, and the people who eventually returned to rebuild the kingdom found that its southern forest had become a very different place. The roads were dangerous, farms were gradually abandoned, and Darkshire became the only substantial human settlement left in the region. When the kingdom could provide little protection, the town relied on its own militia, the Night Watch, led for many years by Commander Althea Ebenlock, daughter of Darkshire's mayor, Elo Ebenlock. The Watchers patrolled the roads by torchlight and defended a population that had chosen to remain despite the spiders, wolves, ogres, and darker things gathering beyond the town. Their resources were limited, and much of Duskwood's story came to depend on travelers willing to investigate the dangers that the Night Watch could contain but seldom remove. The Worgen who hunted through Duskwood had a history reaching back thousands of years, long before the founding of Stormwind. During the War of the Satyr, a group of Night Elf druids sought a form powerful enough to match the enemies they were fighting, and the druid, R'hllor Fangfire, became convinced that the answer lay in the fury of Goldrin, the ancient wolf spirit also known as Logosh. R'hllor and the priestess Belizra Starbreeze created the Scythe of Elune by joining one of Goldrin's fangs to Belizra's staff, which had been blessed by Elune. The weapon allowed the druids to assume the form of the pack, a wolf shape filled with Goldrin's rage, although that rage overwhelmed the discipline the druids had hoped to preserve. They became the first Worgen, and as their violence spread to allies as readily as enemies, Malfurion Stormrage banished them into the Emerald Dream and ordered the Scythe of Elune hidden away. Many centuries later, the Night Elf Sentinel Velindi Starsong was fighting demons in Felwood and prayed to Elune for the power to defeat them. She discovered the Scythe in an old shrine and learned that it could call Worgen from the place where Malfurion had imprisoned them. At first, the creatures answered her commands and fought the demons, but their numbers continued to grow and her control weakened. When Velinde heard that the human archmage Arugol had also summoned Worgen in the Eastern Kingdoms, she travelled east in the hope of learning how he had controlled them. Velinde never reached him. Her trail ended in Duskwood at the mine called Roland's Doom, where she was attacked by a Worgen named Varkus, who wanted the scythe for himself. Velinde died there, and the weapon remained hidden until a frightened man known as Jitters entered the mine with several companions. Jitters found the Scythe of Elune among the rocks, and touching it called more Worgen into the mine. His companions were killed while he escaped with the weapon, pursued through the forest by the creatures he had released. He eventually abandoned the Scythe near the Worgen farmstead, where his flight drew the attention of another group that had been searching Duskwood for powerful relics. These were the Dark Riders of Deadwind Pass. Long ago, they had been traveling merchants who tried to sell fraudulent magical artifacts to Medivh, and the Guardian punished them by binding them to Karazhan and forcing them to collect genuine relics for the tower. Led by Aradin, they continued that work long after Medivh's death, appearing from the darkness whenever an object of unusual power was near. Sven Worgen was away from his farm when the riders arrived. Jitters hid and watched as they questioned Sven's family about the Scythe, then murdered them when they could provide no answer. Sven returned to find his wife and children dead, and his search for the people responsible became one of the oldest stories told through Duskwood's quests. He knew that the Dark Riders had carried out the killings, although for many years he did not know that Jitters had brought them to his home, or that the Scythe of Elune had been the object they wanted. The Scythe eventually passed through the hands of the priest Revelcost and was taken away from Duskwood, first to Karazhan and later into Gilneas, where it became part of the struggle surrounding the Worgen curse. The creatures it had released remained in the forest, inhabiting places such as Roland's Doom, the Rotting Orchard, and the woods beyond Darkshire, where their attacks became another daily concern for the Night Watch. After the cataclysm, Sven's story finally moved towards a conclusion. He had become afflicted by the Worgen curse himself, and the alchemist Oliver Harris used a partial treatment to restore his human mind long enough for Sven to remember what had happened. He confronted Jitters, who could no longer hide his part in the death of the Worgen family. Sven's anger nearly overcame him, but he allowed Jitters to live, leaving him to face the harm he had caused rather than giving him the release of a quick death. The western part of Duskwood is dominated by Ravenhill Cemetery, one of the largest graveyards in the kingdom. By the time adventurers first came to the region, Ravenhill itself had been abandoned, and the cemetery paths were crowded with skeletons, ghouls, and wandering spirits. Their presence was tied in large part to Morbent Fell, a human necromancer who made his home on the hill overlooking the graves and raised the dead beneath him. Sven Worgen believed that destroying Morbent Fell would free Duskwood from one of its worst threats, and with the help of a weapon called Morbent's Bane, an adventurer broke through the necromancer's protective magic and killed him. The undead continued to rise, however, and when Sven returned to the cemetery years later, he found only Morbent's blood-stained clothing in the house where the body should have been. The necromancer had survived by becoming a lich and had withdrawn into the catacombs beneath Ravenhill. With guidance from Sister Elsington and the power of a light-forged crest hidden below the cemetery, another assault was made on his refuge, and Morbent Fell was finally destroyed. His defeat removed the intelligence directing much of the undead activity, although it could not restore Ravenhill or return all of its restless dead to their graves. One of those dead had a history that began far from Duskwood. Morgan Lattimore was a knight who had spent his life protecting the poor and the vulnerable, and when war broke out in Lordaeron, he left his wife, Lys, and their children to serve beside Uther the Lightbringer. He remained in the north through years of war, witnessing the disbanding of the Knights of the Silver Hand, the death of Uther, and the spread of the plague that turned much of Lordaeron into the domain of the Scourge. The thought of returning to his family gave Morgan a reason to endure what he saw, but when he finally came home, he found Duskwood corrupted and his house in ruins. No one in Darkshire could tell him where his family had gone. He searched the farms and nearby settlements, then rode towards Lakeshire, in the hope that they had escaped to Redridge. On the way, he stopped at Ravenhill Cemetery and found a neglected family plot containing 3 small gravestones. The largest bore the name of his wife, Lys Lattimore. Morgan remained at the graves for hours, moving from grief into an uncontrollable rage in which he drew his sword and struck at the stones. 3 cemetery attendants tried to restrain him, and Morgan killed them before understanding what he had done. When the rage passed and he saw the bodies around him, he took his own life. He was buried without ceremony on the edge of the cemetery, separated from the people whose graves he had come to mourn, and within days his body disappeared. The undead figure that emerged became known as Morladim, wandering the cemetery with the same sword and attacking anyone who came near. After Morladin was defeated, the people of Darkshire revealed that one member of Morgan's family had survived. His daughter Sarah had grown up and joined the Night Watch, defending the same community her father had once tried to protect. Sarah gave an adventurer a ring that had belonged to her mother and asked that it be placed on Morgan's grave, along with the assurance that his family did not blame him for failing to save them. The gesture reached what remained of Morgan's spirit. Knowing that Sarah was alive allowed him to release the grief that had held him in Duskwood, and he left his sword, Arceus, behind before passing on. Some of Duskwood's horrors came from the wars and magical disasters surrounding the region, while others began with the choices of people who already lived there. Near Raven Hill, an elderly hermit named Abercrombie asked passing adventurers to help him with a series of seemingly minor errands. He needed thread made from ghostly hair, a strong drink called zombie juice, flowers gathered from the dead, and a crate taken by the ogres of Volgol. The errand supplied Abercrombie with everything he needed to assemble and animate an abomination. When his work was complete, he sent a letter to the mayor of Darkshire, and as Elo Ebenlock read it, the creature began its march towards town. The hermit was already known to the people of Darkshire as the Embalmer, a necromancer with an old grievance against the settlement, and the abomination he created became known as Stitches. The same adventurer Abercrombie had manipulated into helping him was then forced to join the Night Watch in destroying Stitches before it could slaughter the people of Darkshire. Farther north, Manor Mistmantle held the remains of another murderer. Stalvan Mistmantle had once worked as a teacher in Moonbrook and later became a private tutor to the children of the Flint Ridge family, Giles and his older sister, Tiloa. Stalvan became obsessed with Tiloa and interpreted ordinary kindness as evidence that she returned his feelings. When she introduced him to the young man she intended to marry, referring to Stalvan as a trusted older tutor, his imagined relationship collapsed into resentment. Stalvan murdered Tiloa, her fiancé, and the rest of the Flint Ridge family, recording much of his own descent in letters and journal pages that were later scattered across the human lands. An investigation begun in Darkshire gradually reconstructed the murders and led back to Manor Mistmantle, where Stalvan remained as an undead presence until he was killed and buried on the estate. Years later, after the fall of Gilneas, Stalvan's brother Tobias arrived in Darkshire carrying a letter that appeared to have come from the dead man. Tobias had become a Worgen during the Gilnean disaster, and he hoped the accounts of his brother's crimes were mistaken. With the help of Madame Eva and the Mistmantle family ring, he called Stalvan's spirit from its grave and heard the truth directly from him. Stalvan admitted the murders and deliberately pressed upon the anger Tobias carried within his Worgen form, urging him to recognize the same capacity for violence in himself. Tobias transformed and fought beside the adventurer who put Stalvan down for the final time. He survived the encounter, left the past at Manor Mistmantle, and remained one of the people who continued living in Duskwood. These stories gave the forest much of its character because they were discovered gradually, through old graves, missing papers, abandoned houses, and people who knew only one part of what had happened. Duskwood rarely presented a single campaign against a single enemy. Its quests asked travelers to uncover the lives that had ended along its roads and to understand why so many of the dead were unable to leave. Near the center of Duskwood, enclosed by the walls of an ancient crater, the forest changes again. Twilight Grove is greener and more alive than the land around it, and at its center stands one of the great trees connected to the Emerald Dream. The portal beneath the tree was once guarded by the green dragonflight, although the corruption of the Emerald Nightmare brought Ysera's afflicted lieutenants through the great tree portals and into Azeroth. The grove's connection to the dream later became part of the Emerald Dreamway, used by druids to travel between distant natural places. During the Burning Legion's third invasion, Night Elves brought the Scythe of Elune to Twilight Grove so that a balanced druid could carry it against the Legion. A Dark Rider followed them into the grove, killed its keeper, and stole the scythe, drawing the druid and Rivalcos back through Duskwood and Deadwind Pass to the catacombs beneath Karazhan. There they found Aradin and the remaining Dark Riders, together with the relics they had gathered over centuries. Aradin was defeated, the riders' long hunt came to an end, and the Scythe of Elune was recovered. For the people of Duskwood, it closed a story that had begun with Valinda's death at Roland's Doom and the murder of Sven Jorgen's family, even though the Worgen left behind by the Scythe remained part of the forest. The Legion invasion also brought a final disaster to Darkshire itself. A cult known as the Veiled Hand had spread through the town, drawing in members of the Darkshire Council and many of the Night Watch, including Commander Althea Ebenlock. They planned to murder the remaining townspeople and use their bodies in a ritual connected to the Legion. The plot was discovered by a rogue following Garona through Duskwood. Cultists were killed in Ravenhill and Darkshire, while several residents who had refused to join them sheltered together and defended themselves. Among those survivors were members of the Karazhan and Eva families, Tobias Mistmantle and Sarah Lattimore, who remained loyal to the people she had served as a watcher even after many of her companions had turned against them. Althea Ebenlock and the other leaders of the conspiracy were killed, leaving Darkshire with a diminished population and a broken militia. World of Warcraft's main version of the zone still shows the settlement largely as it appeared after the Cataclysm, so the town's exact condition after the Legion's defeat has never been fully established. The surviving residents were last seen holding their ground, continuing a pattern that had defined Duskwood since the darkness first settled over Brightwood. Duskwood's history grew from several disasters spread across many years: the fell magic released from Karazhan, the Worgen called by the Scythe of Elune, the dead raised around Ravenhill, and the people whose grief, obsession, or hunger for power added new dangers to a land already struggling to survive. Darkshire endured because ordinary residents kept its lamps burning and walked its roads with the Night Watch, even when help from the wider kingdom was far away and every abandoned house seemed to contain another unfinished story. The forest remains beneath its permanent twilight, with the roads still passing through Darkshire, Ravenhill, and the shadow of Karazhan. Much of what threatened it has been defeated, although no victory has ever returned Brightwood to the place it was before the First War. Duskwood continues as a wounded part of Stormwind's kingdom, inhabited by people who have learned to live beside its graves and beneath a sky that no longer clears.